Hi, I'm Amol. I'm a startup founder. I started a bunch of companies. The first one that got big was Virgin Mobile. I did a smartphone one called Peak, Halo Neuroscience. I built a collaboration app called Note, Knote. And that's what led to creating Notel, which is what I ran for the last 5 years.
Awesome. Thank you. I was wondering, for me, I'm curious, like you started as a philosophy, you studied philosophy in college and with your PhD. So what led you to startups? I know you did some startups like, pizza delivery for Domino's while you were in school, but why didn't you just, and I believe you worked at McKinsey, but how did you get into building companies?
I wanted to make startups. I mean, when I was a student, I was in college and I was going to graduate in 1998. So like the first day I got to college was the first day that people were downloading web browsers like Mosaic and pretty soon Netscape. And it just seemed so exciting and cool. Entrepreneurship was like already starting to become a thing that some people would dream of doing, I guess, in the 90s. There was like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. But I was studying in New York at Columbia, and I just sort of didn't feel I had any access. I didn't know how to like get involved with something real, And I started like some little projects. I did some work for some companies. I kind of thought it was a startup, but that's not what a startup really is. So it took another few years when I was in Palo Alto in grad school for me to really start connecting with how to do it. So I always wanted to. I mean, I was always excited by the kinds of cool things that get created by businesses, but it was a while before I kind of had access, really.
Right. I think you sort of hinted at something. You said you worked on sort of smaller projects, but you felt like that is not a startup. And I think there's an essay where Paul Graham has where he says, what is a startup? Is it IBM is not a startup, but it's a large tech company. And like a chicken and rice stand, it might be profitable, it might be great, but it's not a startup. So a startup is growth. So like, do you agree with that idea that the primary thing that makes a company a startup is growth?
Well, it might not grow. It could still be a startup. But I think the ambition to build a business with a lot of reach is what distinguishes what those of us in the kind of Silicon Valley community think of from a small business that is still really hard to start. It's still quite ambitious to just get off the ground. Even your chicken and rice stand that you might start somewhere, you're like, I mean, it's not easy. It's not easy. And so it's not some kind of class system or honor or some kind of thing like that. But it's like, you want to build a business that might reach a lot of people. And that's a different thing. Maybe they're both startups, but when I think about it, I mean, I think growth is a really big part of the ambition of this kind of company that Paul Graham was talking about.
Cool. And then, so how did you start like Virgin Mobile? There was already Richard Branson. Like, why did he need you, kind of thing? Like, why can't he just? It's just curious. I'm curious. How did that come about?
Well, I mean, it's a really specific story and it tells you about access, right? So like the way Virgin does stuff is they back other people. Very rarely does anything from Virgin come from Virgin. So, lately he's like talking a lot about his spaceships and the galactic stuff. Definitely he met someone who he thought was cool, like at a party, or maybe his team, he has like a whole team. And he's like, okay, I'll get involved. Early on, he used to like create these things, but for Virgin Mobile back in 2000, my co-founder, the guy who really did it, like it wasn't me, it was this guy. He was living in London and he was getting tired of working at McKinsey and he had met some people socially that worked for Virgin. And he's like, I'm going to move back to America. I think mobile phones are going to be a big thing in America. Not everyone has them yet. There's something we can do. And they're like, you know what? If you go and if you come up with a plan that's good enough, we'll invest. We'll let you call it Virgin Mobile and we do it together. So he got this like permission. And then he met me when he came to San Francisco. He's like, man, I don't know anything about technology. I don't, whatever. And he and I, maybe through one or two steps removed, got introduced. I had done a bunch of things as an undergraduate and I was a pretty technical person. And, we got along quite well. And before he was even able to make a plan, while he was just thinking, hey, what do I want to do? He asked me to join him, and we just worked together. Then it started working, and then it was a company, and then we started raising lots of money, and then, then it was done.
Cool. Awesome. Cool. So I'm sort of going to jump forward to like the founding of Notel. And I'll say for me personally, I think it's about startups in general. There's a big part of startups where, in my view, you want to do something cool or creative, but what ends up is you end up in a situation where you actually also have to lead. And I think like sort of your experience with Notel is just going to be like, so that's not managing. That's like where you just have to, I can't think of any situation ever where it's sort of business crisis is you're just faced with extreme external pressures. So I think for us, it would be useful to sort of like, get some insight from you on just how do you navigate that. So I guess just sort of the scope of Notel. So at some point you guys had 400 million in revenue. So
yeah, I know, it's hard to believe.
It's just like it's just like I'm like, what? So how many people worked at Notel at that time?
Well, so we started Notel, and I'll tell you how, but we started it in, we started sort of working on it in the middle of 2015, January 2016, we get started. We have one customer. And then by March 2020, which is like about 4.5 years, we have a run rate of around 400 million. We are about to close in March, the first quarter, where we're gross profitable, about 500 people from Germany to Japan. So we're in about 20 cities, 10 countries. And in every one of those cities, we have some people. We were serving maybe 400 or 500 companies with different spaces, maybe a little less, 300 or 400, because some companies had multiple spaces. And each space was around $1 million a year of revenue. And so in some ways it was like not that big, it's like, well, I've got 400 customers. They just happen to spend $1 million each every year, but that was the scale of it. It was big, a lot of countries and geographies, lots of people, lots of different roles, like so many different types of skills are needed to run properties for companies, up from things that feel familiar to tech entrepreneurs in like digital marketing, all the way through to like maintenance and repair of buildings. Lots of different types of skills. Like Notel was never one of these central casting Silicon Valley companies where everybody is just like some engineer from an Ivy League school. We had like so many different kinds of skills. Complicated business, man. Very complicated at that size, especially.
Right. So one thing that sort of comes to my mind, the first thing that comes to my mind is there was let's say, we don't have to name that, but there was a competitor, a big like name company that raised a lot of money and was very aggressive. So like, how does that dynamic affect you? Like, how does it affect, did they force you to sort of raise money kind of like a war chest where you have to outmarket them, out-recruit them?
At the time we thought of it as a dynamic that resembles Uber and Lyft, which felt at that time like a nice analogy. But, there's other ones in the history of business, like, Coke and Pepsi. Pepsi today, most people think of as like pretty much like close rival of Coke, maybe even equal. But there was a time in the 60s and 70s where Pepsi had to become number two. There was this really strong number one, and there were a lot of other players. And like, to be number two is a big deal when there's a field of like 100 other guys out there. And you probably have to like search on Google to find out all the different kinds of sodas that there used to be back in the day, like all these other brands. There's this guy from AOL who used to be the COO there. I think his name is Bob Pittman. And he calls it like a number two strategy, where sometimes that's actually like, that's a great thing to be number two. And Pepsi is a great example of that, because you're not competing with number one, you're competing with number 45, So when we started Notel, there were thousands of co-working businesses. And by the middle of 2015, early 2016, there was this one co-working business that was super huge, and everybody knows them, right? We were. But there were a lot of small players. And it was very interesting. And I thought that probably all of them, every single thing from the biggest to the smallest, they were doing co-working. They had missed how you can serve enterprise. And our basic approach was like, all right, we think we have a different go-to-market and it's going to end up serving different customers. Cool. So we have a strategy. But let's make the most of the opportunity to set ourselves apart from the 1,000 small players. Let's be a really annoying challenger, like a number two who's out there saying, we're going to get you, we're going to get you, we're going to get you. Even when we're nothing, even when we're number 500, we're like, we're coming for you, we're coming for you. Guess what? We're catching you in New York, we're catching you in London, we're catching you in Paris. And it was a very effective strategy for us. We made a lot of noise and we were super ambitious. Of course, anybody watching us was like, oh, those guys are so arrogant. They're so dumb. Why would they ever do that? That's fine. I mean, if you are ambitious in life, like you will face that criticism, that you are too ambitious. But it took us from nowhere to the global number two. We were the global number two and we were catching them. Like we were growing a lot faster than them, way more efficiently in terms of capital used and the strength of the model. However, there are some negatives too. That's as long as they're doing well. As long as number one is doing well and you're catching them, that's a cool story. Middle of 2019, those guys screwed up. That was a disaster for them. And for us, it was super tricky because it's like they're tipping over and there's going to be a big splash and you have to watch those waves. So it was a very important period for us in 2019 to just keep saying, look, here's how we're different. We're smarter. This just proves we're right. This just proves we're right. But that's only 30% of what people hear. 70% of what they hear is, oh, well, see, yeah, you guys, the rival to those guys suck. So do you. Very difficult to navigate that. And, that was one of the hardest periods in the business when WeWork was collapsing.
So it was hard. Was it hard in terms of getting customers? Was it hard in terms of recruiting talent, or was it hard in terms of fundraising?
Yeah, of course, everything, all communities make those same calculations about how attractive your product is, how viable your business is. And there are moments where all those communities ride together. They're like, obvious, better model, growing faster, I want to be there. And when things get tough, investors are like, yikes. Customers are like, should I be thinking this over more? Staff starts wondering, should I join? Or if they already joined, they start thinking, hey, did I make a mistake? You know what? I think I see these guys screwing up in the same way as those guys. I'm losing some of my motivation and my trust in the business. So, I think all communities, it's very hard to separate them because they have a pretty similar set of motivations and calculus. They want the business to work. They want it to be successful. A lot of them see similar information. Some people might see some different things, but this big narrative, when you're a big high profile company, that's, it's hard to target those messages.
But just thinking in terms of what happened so now, like, let's say WeWork, they're IPOing, but was that mostly, do you think like that was self-inflicted? Was that an own goal? Or do you think like, it was just, the thesis was tricky, like office space it was more risky than it seemed?
I think it was an own goal. It was an own goal. Part of the popular narrative around the WeWork business is they take a long-term lease and they sell it for a short term. That seems crazy. Why would you do that?
Right.
Very sensible point. Very sensible point. But very few people then also say, what other businesses do that? And virtually every business makes big capital commitments for long-term return. Everybody. If you open a bookstore and you buy a ton of books, 99% of the books you bought, you're not going to sell today. You hope you're going to sell them in 2 years or at some point. If you're a data center and you're going to sink $1 billion into the ground, like no one's going to pay you $1 billion a month to use your data center. Or even like very traditional businesses that have been around forever. Like, I live in New York, and in New York, there's a parking brand. There's several. One of them is called Icon Parking. There's a few other ones. Any brand you've ever seen for parking lots, they manage hundreds of parking lots. Cool. Well, but did you know that they have leases for long durations on the land that some passive owner just owns? And all of their revenue comes from people who park today or park monthly. They have a long-term liability. They try to market it and enhance its value, and they try to sell it in some cut-up kind of way. Every business, in some sense, accumulates some kind of wholesale product or some asset, which they pay for in some way, and then they try to. So I think it's a way oversimplification that the WeWork business was fundamentally flawed in that sense. I think those guys could have been public, and the reason they were not is the own goal. I mean, I think they ran it like fools, and I think they had way too lofty forecasts about what the value really was. And if they had been more sensible, yeah, sure, it would have been public. I don't think it's like, it shouldn't have been 20 times revenue, 10 times revenue. I think there's public comps. I mean, there's a company that's about the same size as WeWork that's public called IWG, which runs Regis, the brand Regis. It trades at like 1.5 times revenue. Okay. That means WeWork in 2019 should have been a $4 billion public company.
Right. So, but as a $4 billion company, it kind of doesn't work because they had raised at that time more than $4 billion. Right. So. Well,
that's the own goal, right? I mean, I think the way they were using capital to launch, they had also spent $4 billion. That's why the IPO was so urgent. And they had only brought online maybe a third of the portfolio that money represented. So that like payback period, time to revenue meant they couldn't get there. Now the company today, it's another $4 billion has been invested since then. And when it goes public, it'll be like 10, 12 billion, something. And maybe SoftBank will be like 1 times return on all the capital they've put in. I don't think it's a great model. I just don't think it's, made to die. The level of capital that the co-working business requires is something like 5 times to 10 times higher than the way the Notel business was designed. When you serve large companies, you use less capital, time to revenue is faster, time to profitability is faster. That's the model. You can have a good or a bad model in a market space. I think the market space makes sense. It's definitely like a big long-term trend on consumption. I think there are a bunch of models that are very attractive in that space. And so I think we're in the early days, man. It's kind of like, you remember all the search engines in the 90s, like these things happen, they smash each other. Sometimes something goes wrong. The competitive dynamic's not right. And then someone finds the right model. I mean, I think at this moment, it's too early to say, but one of those scooter companies will end up being like super valuable, or 2 of them or 3 of them. But there was a moment at South by Southwest 2 years ago where there were like 10 different scooter companies all in the streets of Austin. That's crazy. Right. So, it can be messy.
Right. So sort of going forward now, so you guys are doing fantastic. And then although there's still already this sort of external crisis out there from WeWork, let's say, then the pandemic hits. And initially you had to like lay people off like 30% and furlough another 20%. So just for you, how do you keep morale? How do you keep team spirit? You tell everyone we're in this together, we believe in each other, and then you have to go through that. How do you, for yourself, resolve those 2 things and just keep the team believing in you?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's a crisis just like any other crisis. March 13th, 2020, we close all the offices in the world. It's a really scary situation out there. It's a health crisis, number one. People are worried about their own life, their family's life. And then there's going to be a massive economic crisis for everyone. And that means something for our business, right? So like any crisis, zooming from the big picture all the way into what does it mean for us? And I've had a few of these, Virgin Mobile was just getting started when 9/11 happened. My smartphone company Peak was just getting started in 2008 when Lehman Brothers failed. I've been there, and there are some things that founders need to do when these things happen. You need to assume it'll be really, really bad, worse than you think. We cut half our headcount within a few days of this thing going down last year. I mean, at the time I was like, man, we're cutting super deep. This crisis will be like 6 months. I'm sure we're going to want to rehire these people in another 6 months. Like, this sucks, but we just got to do it. And so we did it.
So
we got to stop.
Like, why do you cut if you think you might have to rehire them? Why do you have to sort of go further than you think is?
Well, because you know that revenues will go down, new deals won't happen, and revenues will go down. I mean, sitting at that moment, some things were obvious. There were going to be, no one's going to do any new deals. And part of the nature of our business is we were accumulating supply. We had this big platform. Every month we're doing like 10 million new in revenue. It's like going like this. And we're like, okay, assume it goes like that. Actually, that's not enough, not flat. And let's say it goes down 50%. And now we're about to have a gross profit profitable quarter, but Q2 could be minus 20, minus 40 million. Q3 could be minus 80 million. Like, I don't know. And I'm being what I thought is conservative at that moment, thinking we have 2 quarters way down, and then maybe in the fourth quarter, we start seeing some recovery. But you just do the math on that level of conservatism, and you're like, wow, that's going to cost a lot of money. We're going to have to reduce our expense load. We got to do anything and everything possible to just reduce expense, even if that hurts the business, because cash is much more important than strategy in a time like that, you know? So we were looking at that moment and we're like, all right, it's going to be really bad. Let's cut very dramatically. Let's put on insanely strict cash controls. We have no idea. I mean, small businesses are going to be shutting down. Enterprises may stop paying vendors. And then that happened. So then it's like 2 weeks in, 4 weeks in, 6 weeks in. Huge Fortune 500 companies stop paying their bills. There is a contract, whatever, they just stop paying. And you have no idea who it is. And by geography, it was varying a lot. The virus is moving in different places. And then a large company might pay 1 month and then the next month they just stop. So even if they paid and it looks like, okay, we're at 80% right now, I don't know what's going to happen next month. It could keep moving like that. And then of course the virus stretched out. You know, we're sitting in like August and people are like, yeah, we're going back to work in the US, Labor Day, France is open. Our colleagues in that market are like, hey, things are good. I just did 2 deals in the month of August. Then you get to September and then everything broke again. Late October, early November, people are like, oh, yay, Biden is elected. We're going to be saved. And then 2 weeks later, that's like a whole nother wave. The variants get started. Then it's January. So the crisis was a lot longer and more complex. And that's true for everybody, not just us. But for us, it's Office. It's our product. I mean, the thing we're selling people. People have like 2-year-long contracts with us, which means in the 12 months from March to March, half of customers had reached their contract. They're not going to extend in the middle of the crisis. And so if I thought revenue was down 10%, 20%, well, by the end of the year, it was down 30%. I felt lucky about that. I was like, okay, somehow this team of people, thank goodness, you guys are amazing. We've been able to hold on to these relationships with customers and we have them still ready to come back when they're ready to come back. And then the crisis keeps going. Very difficult situation if your business is offices, right?
Right. Yeah, because this is exactly like just what you described. That's just the nightmare scenario. Because as you said, I think, you do one deep cut exactly because you don't want to do this trickle by trickle cuts where people think like, then it's kind of almost like inflation expectations. You now expect like cuts, more cuts, and that just demoralizes people. So even for you personally, how do you keep believing that you are the one? And so were there moments where how do you keep, every time I see you, you seem pretty upbeat. Like it's just hard to, are there any techniques that you use or how do you internally just stay motivated?
Well, let me make it worse for you for a second. So remember that COVID goes down after we spent 6 months trying to explain to others and ourselves that our business is not like the co-working business. But people for 6 months have been hammering all the bad news about that guy is coming out, every stupid thing they did. And you're like, no, it's different. We're doing it this way. Just relax. But then when COVID comes in, it increases the pressure tremendously on the business, but it's in the backdrop of where people had already started worrying like, hey man, are we going to be good? Like what's good? And Q1, we're actually gross profit positive. And I'm like, see, That's the whole point. This is the whole point of everything we've been doing. This is the proof. The numbers don't lie. And then it's COVID. So now if you combine those, and then you got to wonder both privately as the leader and then around the organization, it's very intense. It's very intense. But so what do you do? I mean, it's not like a simple recipe. I think that there is a benefit to crisis because a crisis is wartime. And in wartime, people are ready to come together if they believe that their mission is worthy. And that was very important. I saw that among our people. We're like, all right, all the rules are off now. All we have is each other. We got to just rely on each other. And that was really valuable. But, somebody's relative dies, somebody's father is in the hospital. Like there's all these cracks happening. And for the founder, of course, it's the loneliest role. Everyone always says that, which doesn't, whatever. You're also like super powerful, have lots of equity. You're like much better off perhaps than somebody who's like laid off in round one. So there's nothing to feel any terrible pity for the founder, but for the job of founder, it is very hard. And, my only observation when I speak with other entrepreneurs over the years is that there is a certain kind of disposition, like a certain way you are going in, which can really help a lot. And I actually consider it one of the criteria. I think it is like, if you don't have this, it's going to be too hard. Because starting companies means continually living on the edge of disaster. Like there's that, there's that book, it's in the series, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series by Douglas Adams. The third book is called The Restaurant at the Edge of the Universe. So they, in the story, they've like invented time travel. And so somebody opens a restaurant that is at the exact moment that the universe is ending. So everything's like blowing up and the restaurant moves backwards in time, like slowly. So it never quite ends. To be the founder is to live in that restaurant at the edge of the universe. On the first day, your company is going to go out of business that night. Like most people, once they join a company, they forget about that because when you start a company, the moment that you let it come out of your mind, the company's dead. Right. It only exists because of the power of your like conviction and your dedication to it. At some point, something starts going right and the business isn't going to go out of business tonight, but it might next week or next month. At some point you raise a little more money and it's like, okay, we've got some revenue, maybe 6 months. Something good better happen in the next 6 months. Otherwise, then it's 1 year. And so I think that by the time you get to these really big platform situations where there's like 1,000 people all looking at you, the hardest part is actually, at least for me, this was the hardest part. It's kind of the inverse of what your question is about. So your question's about, hey man, how do you get through this thing? To me, the hardest part, I wasn't scared in that way because I'd already been through all the moments where I'm like, if those guys don't wire and they don't sign the financing or this contract doesn't close, I'm probably going to fire 100 people in like 2 weeks. So I'd been through that like 1,000 times already. So then we're there at COVID and I'm like, here we go again. It's 2008, it's 9/11, whatever. Here we go. So the hard part actually for me was people think you're like a robot or something. They just don't see your humanity in that moment. And if you're not human, and they can't see why would you make the judgments that you would make and how are we on the same team? How are we on the same page? That was really tough, actually.
Right. Yeah. Like a lot of what you say, it resonates. Obviously, you're going through the most intense experience. I think for me, like one thing that recently happened is so you have like a different view from one of your investors. So do you regret raising from that investor? Do you get raising how much you raised? Was there something you could have done differently?
Well, I mean, very specifically, Notel is in someone else's control today because of that bad decision by me. We let these guys into the company, this brokerage, Newmark. They invested some money in maybe like the Series B or something. CEO of the company They just went public, actually. It's a pretty big brokerage, but they're only recently a public company. It's like a $2 billion company. The guy comes to see us. Amazing guy, really nice, smart, great reputation. He's a broker, which, you know, I always kind of wonder about real estate brokers. But he's like, you guys are the right thing. I want to put myself behind you guys. We're a strong company. We'll help you. Okay. That sounds great. I mean, what a validation point. You know, a huge industry player wants to get involved. Well, you know, a few years later, they're like, oh, you know, one of our sister companies is an investment bank. We actually have a common ownership structure, and, you know, you should meet Cantor Fitzgerald. I'm like, okay. I mean, I guess I've heard about them. And they're like, no, we should let us be your bank. We'll do the work for you. We'll do the financings and we'll do all this stuff. We're like, all right, great. I mean, family relationship, I guess we should use it. Some of the people there were okay. Yeah, they didn't do amazing stuff. Honestly, I wasn't thrilled. And it was one of my regrets to do this kind of nepotistic thing. And it's 2020, it's the summer, and then there's like the next wave, and then it's December. And then, now remember, Newmark is an investor in our company, and our bankers are Cantor. And on December 30th, I get a phone call from our lender, our venture lender, which is some bank called Triple Point Capital. And there's another one called Bridge Bank. December 30th, I get a call from the lenders, and they're like, hey, you know how you were going to refinance the debt? You know, you're going to have to deal with someone different because we sold the debt to somebody else. They'll give you a call.
God.
It's December 30th. So like New Year's is the Saturday. So this is like a Thursday night. And we're like, what? We were going to buy your debt. We were going to like refinance this thing. And they're like, we weren't feeling it. We went this other direction. So then the next phone call I get is from this guy who is the chairman of Newmark and the managing partner of Cantor Fitzgerald. There's one guy up here. And he's like, hey, I bought the debt.
He personally bought the debt?
I'm like, you personally bought the debt? And he's like, we bought it. I'm like, ooh. It took a little while for me to learn about exactly what the deal was, but Newmark bought the debt. But this guy calling me the chairman of whatever, wasn't the CEO of Newmark or whatever. It was just like, what? You bought the debt? Is that good news? Like that you helped us refinance this thing? And he's like, yeah, it's great news, man. We're going to like do a lot of stuff together. I'm like, oh, okay. So then like another few days later, I got another call from the same guy. And he's like, oh, I bought the rest of the debt. I own all your debt. And I'm like, why did you do that? Like, maybe you could have, why did we not talk about it? Like, why would you go there? Clearly you have a lot of access to information. So like, why are you doing? He's like, we just got to get out of this situation. It's a tough situation. In short, it's a few days later and they're like, okay, so we own your debt. You're in default in these following ways. We're going to foreclose on that debt. You've got 24 hours, otherwise you're toast or whatever, like some short period. And you're going to have to shut down the entire business. Or we can lend you another $20 million right now on the condition that you bankrupt the company, run an auction for it, and let us buy it. And I was just like speechless. I was like, oh, holy crap. These guys basically chose this moment to put almost another $100 million total in, buy all the debt and then put in the new stuff, just in order to buy the company and wipe out everybody else. It was just like consummate Wall Street type, whatever. And your question, if you remember, this is a long story ago that you asked, but it's like, hey, with all these big investors, all this money, was there anything you regret? Oh yeah. Not knowing who was in there, not knowing what they would do and how they behave, not having done enough diligence to even ask a single person, hey, what do you think of this guy? Because as soon as I asked anybody, I got like 100 to 0 reviews on like, not surprised. This is what happened. What a cluster. It was a disaster. And it was really bad for investors, but it was also bad for employees. It was bad for our partners, our customers. Inside that process, we like walked away from customers. There were customers that are in spaces and we're like, we're not doing this building anymore. We're out. I was so disappointing that that's what we were forced to do. We ended up being forced to do that. I mean, arguably it's all within their rights and it's capitalism and it's dog eat dog world and whatever, but you can choose. I mean, there are rules, and then you can also choose how you want to behave in life, you know? So that's what I regret.
But one thing is, did you have enough, even like in hindsight, you know that you act this way, but at that time, was there any due diligence you could have done to know that this is how this person was? Because you mentioned like when you asked, people say, I'm not surprised. But do you think they'll tell you that only after he kind of screws you over? Or do you think you could have researched your investor before you actually took the financing?
Yeah, I could have. Yeah, it was just a question away. And, you know, it's true more generally. So in venture and in situations that are not quite as unique as this one, because this dude is like famously awful. To me, the simple diligence thing was just to see like, hey, there's this public company investing. Who's in charge? How does it run? What's the governance? Like, what's the deal? I'm sitting here with the CEO. Does he actually decide these things? Because in the event later, that guy was nowhere to be seen. It was like amazing to me. I was like, wow, this guy, this person who I'm dealing with isn't even consulting. Like it was amazing to watch it. So yeah, I could have done some of that. That would have been kind of basic and it would have been easy to ask. And, you know, the real estate business is full of all these shady people. And they are very outspoken about each other, you know, and it would have been a sensible thing to do. More normal for like a more normal entrepreneur or for that kind of context. It's also true. There are some venture firms that treat founders well, that treat teams well, they treat other investors well. And all that stuff is open secrets, man. I mean, they don't publish it on the web, but you ask a firm that is a top tier firm, like a great reputation firm, that's what's coded in there. And when you say, hey, I want to talk to this other firm, and someone says, oh, I'm friends with this guy, I'm friends with that person, that's kind of what that means. When someone says, I've never heard of these guys, that is like always super worrisome, especially when someone says, I haven't had a great experience. I mean, people will use milder language, I guess. But reputation matters a lot because when things are going well, treating people well is important, as important as the opposite, because when things are going well, you can get greedy and start screwing stuff up. And then when things are not going well, you're facing challenges. Yeah, that's the time to come together and get through. Some of the best companies in the world have like stared over the precipice into the, you know, abyss, right? Like there was a moment in 2000 around before 9/11, after the dot-com crash, that like Amazon was like weeks away from running out of money. And that happens to many companies. There's a famous email from Elon Musk at Tesla back in like 2010 or 11, where he's like, you bastards, stop leaking information. We're going to make it. They get some loans from Obama and like the company makes it. Now it's $1 trillion company. Well, at that moment, everyone's like, ha ha, Elon, you arrogant fool. So everybody faces these moments, you know, but it really depends on how people behave. And I think reputation, that's how it's made. It's definitely made on those difficult moments.
So one thing that comes to mind, so you've led a team. They've built this business up to, you know, 400 million in recurring revenue. So isn't there an element where, let's say I'm an investor, even if I want to capture equity, but somehow I need to sort of, you don't sort of kill the chicken that laid, the goose that laid the golden egg. So isn't there some element where if you like had a great relationship with the investor, so they believed isn't that the only way ultimately to sort of avoid this kind of zero-sum infighting thing?
Well, I mean, look, part of it is just personal integrity of the different people around the table. There are moments where a short-term personal gain at the expense of others, to some people that's tempting, they're going to do it. It's part of it. I definitely think that this whole thing went down the way it did, partly because of me. So partly these guys are like, well, you know, Amol's running the company. I don't like how he's running it. He's screwing up. I'm tired of waiting for him to fix it. If it had been the opposite and the guy was like, oh, this guy's amazing in difficult situation, it's really hard, but you know, no one better to do it than him. Of course they would have made a different decision. Sure. And I could have seen that picture more clearly and perhaps invested my own energy on just that like relationship management dimension. I surely could have done that. Yeah. I mean, because I was spending a lot of time on customers and my team, got to keep them together, keep customers together. And I was pretty focused on financing. Like, well, there's going to be a tough period. There's going to have to be another financing. So I was spending a lot of time and energy on that. I wasn't spending a lot. And honestly, we were having daily board meetings and all this kind of stuff. We were talking to a lot of the important stakeholders, but there was this guy 3 steps away. There wasn't that much dialogue going on. I don't know. Maybe I could have seen deeper into it. Yeah. So I definitely have a role to play in that. It's not just like me pointing at other people. Yeah. I mean, some kind of relationship could have made a difference for sure.
Got it. Yeah, that's just like it's just like gut wrenching. You know what I'm saying? Like the story is just gut wrenching.
Well, I mean, it's business. We said about founders, it's hard to have too much sympathy for them being stressed out, right? And I mean, on the one hand, how lucky am I to have had a chance to build a business, billion plus whatever valuation, all this kind of stuff. That's great. And I guess, the opposite side of that is it's a high stakes game at a big casino, and sometimes it goes the other way. I mean, it's fine.
Good. So what are you up to now?
Well, I am doing the stuff that I really love the most. I mean, I got to say that like the early steps in building companies is why I like building companies. I mean, you think you're doing it so you can build this like big impact growth hologram, whatever. But once you've done it, it starts being pretty unfun to do that.
Right.
All the staff meetings and the all hands and the thousands of all the stakeholders and whatever. But like that moment of invention when you find something that doesn't work, that you see it's just everywhere, and you figure out some kind of way that, aha, this thing can do, like that's super rewarding. It's super rewarding. And so I'm fiddling around with a bunch of stuff. Like I think of myself as being in a lab. Like every 5 or 6 years, I kind of get back into the lab and I start building something new. And it's really refreshing and energizing. I mean, I have now spent several years without making a single angel investment, without like starting a new side project. I've been like cutting away all my side projects for the last few years. Now suddenly I can do anything I want. And there's so many interesting things to work on. So I've been getting into it. I've been getting into it on a bunch of different topics.
Cool. Like there was one cool thing that you did. You've done many cool things, but one thing that I want to do someday is you actually developed a building in Long Island, east of East.
Yeah. Yeah. In Long Island City, Long Island City,
right.
The 5 boroughs, right?
Right.
And that was really tricky, but super rewarding. Yeah. Cause like, you can't buy a Virgin mobile phone anymore.
Right.
And I have some peak smartphones that you can't use anymore because they're like 10 years out of date. But this building is like here. It's going to be here for 100 years. It's pretty cool.
Right. So how much did it cost to, if you wanted to develop a building like that, like it was like 6 stories?
Yeah, it's about a 10-story building, and it's not a huge building. It's 10 stories. There's like a couple of apartments on each floor. So call it like 15 apartments because some of them are bigger. And 15 apartments, it's like a $20 million building basically. And the cost to build it is like around 10. So you use some bankers and lenders and stuff like that. And some of it is equity.
God, cool. Yeah, that's pretty cool. And apparently you have a picture that's in MoMA. Is that correct? A photograph.
Yeah.
So it's a photograph of what?
It's so random. But it was around the time of 9/11, there were all these like pop-up exhibitions people were doing around the city. I mean, you might have heard or you might remember that moment where people had posted all these signs because they were looking for their loved ones. And some art curators did these exhibitions where they just asked the public to come and put some pictures, contribute their pictures of New York, like a way to be connected and feel together. So the Museum of Modern Art did that. So they borrowed one of these curators. They're like, this is awesome. Do this at MoMA and do it bigger. And I was like, wow, that's so great. I'm going to submit a picture too. So I submitted a picture. It was the early days of digital photography. And so I took a picture of a lamppost in Central Park in the snow. And it was like lit. And then I like messed with it on Photoshop. So I made 2 lampposts. That was it. But they were kind of weirdly close together because like they wouldn't exist like that in reality. But after I had made the picture, I looked at it and I realized, wow, that looks just like the World Trade Center.
Got it.
So I submitted the picture to them, and for some reason they kept it.
Got it.
They kept some of the pictures from that. I mean, it's like not that big a deal, but it is kind of cool. I have a photograph in the Museum of Modern Art.
Yeah, so you do seem to have like a relationship with like New York, like in your view and sort of with your experience in like real estate, like, right now we're in like Midtown, and it seems like it's pretty bad. It's just like, so what is kind of your views on kind of office real estate, Midtown New York?
That's the part that's going to suffer a lot. I guess like big picture, cities are a good thing, and they exist because they work. They like do something. It's not just that they seem like a good idea, that they're like a functionally productive invention of human society. That's why they exist. So they got started 5,000 years ago, and now they're bigger than they ever were. There's more of them than they ever were. More people live in cities than ever in history. And what cities do when they bring people together is they make people richer and smarter and healthier, which are pretty good things. The biggest cities in the world, they attract lots of poor people who are coming from places where they have no opportunity, no economic kind of prosperity. They have no education. They're looking to find a mate. They're looking to climb the ladder. They're just looking for better services. That's why cities started, marketplace for labor and for commerce. So that's still true. That's true. And every once in a while, over the 5,000 years, and even over the last 100 years, cities faced like a massive crisis as they've got too big. Health has been a crisis again and again every 30, 40 years in cities. In the 19th century, there were all these big breakouts. Everyone was dying, cholera and all this kind of stuff, tuberculosis. And so they created irrigation so that you would have fresh water in your house instead of getting it from a well, which was contaminated. All right. There was the first flu pandemic in 1918. There was other health crises along the way in the 50s. There was AIDS in the 80s. Like these things all happened in cities. AIDS happened in New York first. That's where it blew up. And we figured them out. Public safety, sometimes, crime and like people couldn't figure it out or whatever. There's all these things that continue to challenge cities from time to time to time. We always fix them. After 9/11, people were like, oh, no more big buildings, no more cities. It's too dangerous. I want to live in the country. Well, no, that was not correct. I mean, we had to find a way to fix that problem. And I think this problem, we will also fix it. I think what happens after any one of these is, the shape changes a little bit. And those office towers in Midtown, I think those are like the most vulnerable thing, right? I think people are still scratching their head. They're like, are we ever going to go work in that place again? Now that we can work wherever we want to. And you don't have to take a view on that to take a view that New York's going to be great. You can ignore those office towers and still say cities make sense for so many reasons. We are going to work together. That's fine. And you could zoom in and take a view on those buildings, and you could say, well, we do work together for a reason. And there is stuff that happens when we're together. And we all now have a year of like not being together, and we feel what's missing, the mentorship and connectivity and the serendipity and whatever. And, I think the only reason you trade that away is if you think you might die. And at this point, we're well on our way to having the virus fully under control. Everyone's going to be vaccinated. There are some important lessons about safety and health, about managing it. But we're just not going to be in this situation forever. And so, that office building probably needs some change, some redesign, but people are going to work together.
Cool. Yeah, I definitely believe that, and I certainly hope that. Cool. So awesome. It was great. It was great to have you, Amol. I think this has been, in this series, this has been the most soulful interview we've had. So, thank you very much for sort of sharing your thoughts.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome.